Hello, everybody out there, fellow readers. How are you? I'm doing another upload on another Southern writer, this time Eudora Welty. Sort of a tie-in to my last video, my first video on William Faulkner's Absalom. She was another fiction writer from that period, who was born and bred Mississippian, and was also writing in the late 30s. A little bit, got her start a little bit after Faulkner was sort of established. A little background on her. First of all, how about recognizing her face? Look at that face. Wow, that is a countenance on her. This is the face you'll see as you're going through her beautiful short stories. Unbelievable, huh? This is the cover to the Modern Library of the World collection of short stories of hers. This came out in the early 1990s. Anyhow, I drew most of the short stories and read them from this edition. Yes, I wanted to stay in the great MISSI and focus on another Southern writer. So I sort of want to build off my last video. And she got further in her schooling than Faulkner did. She finished high school and actually attended several colleges studying different things, including literature, and kind of led a cookie cutter life in that regard academically. Went into the workforce as best she could. Straight out of college, she went to New York, and then shortly returned in the Depression era, United States, in the 30s, back to her home state. She's a Southern writer. She's from the South. The South produced her, but she's not a Southern writer in the same way that Faulkner is. She's not. Her literature isn't concerned with the South as a region and her sort of identity as a Southerner or the soul of that region at all. She's sort of her fiction, sort of in general, it transcends. Is looking for transcendence from all place. I think one critic was saying, and I agree with that from the short stories that I've read of hers. So definitely, she's different than Faulkner in that regard. But I wanted to, balance it out, a little gender equality, and focus on a female writer as well. And she really stood up. Overall, her fiction is just unbelievably beautiful. She's the things that have endured from her works have been short stories. So I'm focusing on that. That'll be the title of this video, is Eudora Welty's The Short Stories of Eudora Welty. She did write a couple novels, but they weren't as intriguing to me to get into, at least at this point in time. And she also wrote an autobiographical essay on writing, simply called One Writer's Beginning, writing about her craft. And as I said, it's a collection of essays, which I haven't read yet. But any viewers seeking further biographical information, that would be a good place to start. So I want to focus on 3 short stories she did that really blew me away. There's going to be Death of a Traveling Salesman, which is not to be confused with Death of a Salesman, the play, which was turned into a movie, and film always taking over, eclipsing literature from public consciousness, which is something I do not like, but don't get those two confused, alright? Death of a Traveling Salesman, A Worn Path, and The Petrified Man. 3 stories that are pretty, I think, iconic of her work, and which are pretty well received and which people remember. If you, to give you an idea of actually just one more point about her and Faulkner, if you search for Faulkner on YouTube, you'll get around 13,000 results. If you search for Eudora Welty, you'll get about 1,300 results. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. A quote that I wanted to share from Ruth Van de Kieft, a professor who wrote the introduction to this nice little collection. Quote, "The dominant characteristics of Miss Welty's fiction are the lyrical impulse that provides its inciting force and unity. The emphasis on place gives it focus, and the scope and experimentation that lend it variety." So she sort of, I thought that was summed up her style quite simply and nicely. Yeah, her style is just so graceful, and the way she takes the reader in, and there is variety, as Ruth just pointed out. The subject matter goes anything from like an epic journey to dialogue between two people in a hair salon. I mean, it's so varied what she's able to cover, and that reference you'll get in a minute when I talk about the Petrified Man. Another thing I got from Eudora Welty's stories is her emphasis on childhood and impressions made on the child, and that sort of reservoir of memory that's so important for good writers. She utilized that beautifully, I thought. I read A Memory, which I won't get into in too much detail, but was basically about a child on the beach and their impressions and sort of fragility in the face of these harsh groups of people all around them on the beach through the mind of a young child. There's also a PBS documentary on Eudora Welty, which you may have seen, again, film and television sort of replacing literature. If anybody has seen that, I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of that. If it's worth checking out, let me know. The first story I mentioned before was Death of a Traveling Salesman. This uses a theme which Eudora Welty utilizes quite often, which is basically just a man or woman, a human being trudging along a path, encountering struggle. The perfect metaphor for life. And she really uses that vehicle a lot in several of her short stories, and she did it quite well in this one. The man encounters an old lady. His car's been stuck in a ditch, and he's, I think, coming down with influenza, sickness, death is another theme, which she's used in this in a lot of her short stories. And it's about the realization of him imposing and sort of southern hospitality. Actually, a theme I think that Faulkner used in Light in August. And the travails and struggle going along this path. That's just a brief sort of summary of that. That's one of my favorite stories of hers, and you should note that it was the first story that sort of got her recognition. I think it was accepted into some Southern Review, might be the Southern Review, if I'm not mistaken, in the late 30s. The second story I want to talk about is A Worn Path, and this follows a black old lady, a day in the life sort of, and her trudging through the woods again. Nature is another theme employed by Welty. And she walks along a trace, as they call it. This might be a regional word. It's not used up in the north as much, but a trace just being a path beaten in through the woods. Notch's Trace, Old Notch's Trace, is another place name, a rare place name that Welty uses a lot in her short stories as well. So she's walking sort of through the woods towards civilization. It's winter in the south. Welty kind of failed a little bit in describing that. It's hard for someone from the north to imagine the south any other way than the sweltering heat of the August sun or something like that. So I thought she did all right with describing the weather, but this takes place around the holiday, around Christmas, and which also serves as a theme and a symbol of giving and generosity. And it's really eloquent the way she describes this old lady making her way through the woods and sort of testing people in general in her last years, she can feel it. You know, death is all over this short story. She knows she's going to die, and she's sort of testing people one last time to see how she feels about people and if they're willing to help her and sacrifice for, you know, a little old lady walking through the woods, a black old lady. Yeah, nature again was used a lot. She winds up in a hospital. I won't give away the ending. It's very short and pleasant read. I recommend it. A Worn Path. And she's visiting her grandson who has a throat ache. Very strange, but interesting story. And the last one, my main focus for this video is going to be the Petrified Man. The Petrified Man is a reference to a member of a freak show, a traveling freak show. And I guess this was a common thing back then, that they used to have Petrified Man, a man of stone who couldn't move, who was sort of frozen, and having some condition. And that's a reference to a character in this short story. This is gossip. This is a short story about gossip. The entire story is told through dialogue. From the first opening page, which I'll read to you here, to all the way through to the end. There's rare sections of straight narration to set some action up, but besides that, it's all dialogue, which evokes the underlying theme of gossip and people talking to each other. So it starts off, just to give you a taste. Reach in my purse and get me a cigarette without no powder in it if you can, Miss Fletcher, honey, said Leota at her 10 o'clock shampoo and said customer. I don't like no perfumed cigarettes. That just gives you a little idea of what the dialogue's like. There's reiterations of, I declare, no siree. Can you feature that? All throughout this dialogue. It's just brilliant. Any good writer has an ear for their local dialect, and Eudora Welty just exceeded that and mastered that completely in this short story. Just the dialogue is absolutely amazing. It makes the story so beautiful. It's about gossip, and it's about people that you can feel the writer has sort of a muffled disdain for. These two women quacking away at each other in a beauty parlor. And it's very much of the era. There's lots of references to magazines and types of cigarettes and cars that sort of designate a certain class of people, which most people won't get unless you ask your grandma and she's still alive. But I found it hilarious and tragic and really just so efficient in giving a little bit of a moral statement about what she feels about gossip, about people just falling into vulgar ways. They eat certain peanuts the way they smoke certain types of cigarettes. They go see traveling freak shows for entertainment. They're what we would call today trashy type of people. And they also with their children on the ass a couple times, and are pretty rough with their kids. It's Leota, the main character, is the hairdresser, and her 10 o'clock is Miss Fletcher. And they talk about a third very integral character, Mrs. Pike, who is being gossiped about the most, who has kind of a mouth on her, if you believe these ladies, and has been gossiping about Mrs. Fletcher's pregnancy. The story, in terms of the time, is really beautifully laid out. It's set over 2 weekly appointments at this hair salon. And most of the action takes place before these appointments, and you're hearing through these characters what happened in the interim, in that week between the 2 appointments. This is so impressive. I was so impressed by this short story, and makes me want to continue reading more stories by this wonderful author. They pick apart Mrs. Pike out of jealousy, pretty much. There's also rapes that occur in this short story. They don't occur in the straight narration, but are talked about and referenced. They involve the Petrified Man. I'll leave it at that and try not to spoil it for you. But there's a $500 reward to be had. And at one point, when they're picking apart Miss Pike out of jealousy, they, Mrs. Fletcher, I believe, says the awful statement of, I guess those women, the 4 women who were raped, didn't have the faintest notion they'd be worth $125 a piece someday to Mrs. Pike. She's showing how low these people are, how much further can they stoop. And they're just totally picking apart, like I said, this poor woman, and gossiping about her. Well, I hope this sparks some interest in this amazing author from the American canon, Eudora Welty. Amazing short story fiction writer. And probably some of her novels are great too. Hey, if you've read something of hers and it impressed you and you want to talk about it, let's get a dialogue going. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Thank you for listening.